Well, welcome to the 700 Club. As we told you yesterday, America, the home of the free and the land of the free and the home of the brave, has more people locked up than any nation on earth. And locking up the largest prison population is very expensive, $200 billion a year at a minimum. And guess what? For some corporations, it's a major money-making enterprise. Private prisons have been thriving, raking in cash to put people in cages. But as Jennifer Wishon reports, these prisons for profit are now falling out of favor.
Private prisons have been around for decades. They promote themselves as cost-effective community partners, primed to save taxpayer dollars. But critics say that's because they cut corners, creating unsafe conditions. It's big business. Major private prison companies are even publicly traded, and last year raked in billions of profits. According to the Sentencing Project, they operate in 29 states, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons relies on them too. John Pfaff, professor at Fordham Law School and author of Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform, says even though private prisons only house about 9% of the total prison population, they grab the most attention.
I think people feel like there's something distinctly morally repugnant about paying cash to put people in cages.
They get paid for each inmate locked up in their facilities. In 2012, Corrections Corporation of America, now known as CoreCivic, offered a shocking deal. The company would purchase prisons in 48 states if the states would guarantee a 90% occupancy rate.
I'm not saying corporations are evil, but corporations exist for one thing: to make money, maximum profit. That's okay if you're making widgets or toothpaste, but when you're dealing with people and you're making money off of prison, you're starting to treat people like they're toothpaste.
Jesus Cardenas was locked up for check fraud. He served part of his time in a state prison before being transferred to a private one, and says he immediately noticed a difference in the level of security.
They were just going through the motions. These officers that were there were just drawing a paycheck.
He says fights like this one at a private correction center in Idaho were a daily occurrence. And unless someone was severely hurt, he says they went unnoticed. ICE also contracts with private facilities. In a federal lawsuit filed last month, a Mexican woman says within hours of being deported, she and 2 other women were taken from their dorms and raped by officials at a facility run by CoreCivic in Houston. Criminologist Fran Buntman says when a government detains or sentences someone, it has an obligation to see it through.
We've taken away their liberty rights to control their own lives. We as a society and the government as the institution looking after them actually have a responsibility to their welfare. We as a society cannot subcontract out that responsibility to a private agency.
Incarceration is a big ticket item. States spend $50 billion a year. And all said, when you factor in police and prosecutors, it costs a total of $200 billion tax dollars to round up, prosecute, and keep inmates behind bars. Over the last year, activists successfully waged campaigns to squeeze private prisons financially, pressuring half a dozen major banks to cut off their financing. Investors pulled back too, and that could keep the companies from growing. Professor Pfaff says some private prisons do operate better than others, just like those in the public system, and points out state-owned prisons also have incentives to keep their doors open. It's just less transparent. No matter where inmates serve time, he encourages Americans to focus on the power of redemption.
Jesus never wrote anybody off, right? You know, that very last moment, he didn't care what the person next to him on the cross was up there for. And I think that there's a very important lesson in what he didn't say and what he didn't ask about how we should view, even those who have done amongst the worst things possible, that we should never just throw them away.
During the last decade, the overall prison rate has fallen by 15%, but America still locks up more people than any other country, and private prisons appear here to stay, at least for now. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
You know, I asked our staff if they could add up how many offenses there are that have criminal sanctions to them. When they got to 300,000, they stopped counting because they still don't know. Is it 300,000, 400, 500,000? These agencies have put on criminal sanctions that are just incredible. And the cost in money is horrible, but the cost in damaged lives is even worse. And we talk particularly about young people who their brains aren't quite settled yet, and they're a little bit more reckless. So at 16 or 17, they go out and they take a joyride in somebody's automobile. The next thing is grand theft auto, and they're in for a felony, and that is on their record for the rest of their lives. So they're now a felon. They can't vote. They can't serve as a police officer. They can't pass the bar. They can't have other civil privileges because they now are felons. So somebody at 18 is ruined for life. 300, 400, 500,000 crimes in America. And we lock up more people than any other nation on the face of the earth. Something has got to be done. And I've mentioned, Jennifer thought it might be a little more difficult, but I think at least the president should begin to work on that one. And if he wants to do something that would make him very popular in the country, it would be so easy to say, I'm, as the chief executive, are going to nullify these executive agency decisions that are putting people in jail. And then we'll deal with congressionally mandated penalty. That's a different matter. But this one should not take congressional approval. And he ought to do it with a stroke of the pen, in my opinion, that he could, I mean, it would make a huge difference. And think of that, $200 billion a year and more, not to mention the social cost of what it does to the people's family.
To have a quota on prisoners, 90%, that's shameful.
Well, of course it is.
Horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I have a contract. You've got to keep 90% of population, which means I've got to either keep the people in jail or else you've got to give me more of them. It's horrible. Well, folks, in other news, congressional hearings on police brutality begin today, and one officer speaks out saying, would you stop treating us like animals and thugs? John Jessup has more.
That's right, Pat. 12 witnesses are slated to testify in today's House Judiciary Committee hearing on police brutality, including George Floyd's brother, who spoke at Floyd's emotional funeral service in Houston Tuesday.
I believe that a change is going to come. I want justice for my brother, my big brother.
The hearing today on Capitol Hill comes after Democrats introduced a major police reform bill. Congressional Republicans are working with the White House on their own measures.
Senator Tim Scott to lead a group that is working on a proposal to allow us to respond to the obvious racial discrimination that we've seen on full display on our television screens over the last 2 weeks.
Meanwhile, new allegations are surfacing about the relationship between George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, the officer charged with his murder. CBS News spoke with an employee at the Minneapolis nightclub where both men work security. The employee said the two had bumped heads over Chauvin's, quote, aggressive treatment of some customers. Well, some officers are pushing back against the portrayal of police as abusers. Mike O'Meara is president of the New York Police Benevolent Association. Standing in front of the microphone with other law enforcement officers, he spoke out at a press conference Tuesday afternoon.
I am not Derek Chauvin. They are not him. He killed someone. We didn't. We are restrained. And you know what? I'm saying this to all the cops here. Because you know what? Everybody's trying to shame us. The legislators, the press, everybody's trying to shame us into being embarrassed about our profession. Well, you know what? This isn't stained by someone in Minneapolis. It's still got a shine on it. And so do theirs. So do theirs.
New York's legislature is moving to change a law that keeps police disciplinary records secret. Well, chaos in Georgia. That's how massive problems at polling places in the state's Tuesday primary is being described. People waited for hours to vote as machine malfunctions and provisional ballot shortages delayed the process. Another issue, absentee ballots that didn't arrive on time. Democrats are blaming the Republican Secretary of State who selected the new machines. Brad Raffensperger had also encouraged all registered voters to request an absentee ballot. Election officials fear this is merely a preview of potential problems in November's election. Well, the economy will be a major factor for voters in the presidential election. While there are signs it's starting to come back from the COVID shutdown, analysts say it could take years to fully recover. That's why many are watching the Federal Reserve Board today as it delivers its prediction for the next quarter. Caitlin Burke reports.
All eyes are on the Federal Reserve Board, set to deliver their first economic forecast and policy proposals since late last year, before the pandemic caused an unprecedented economic shutdown, but on the heels of an encouraging jobs report that shows millions of Americans are going back to work.
We sure did get a blockbuster jobs report on Friday. There's no question about that. And boy, was that good news when we most needed it, given the havoc and chaos of the last 3 months. But we're not out of the woods yet.
The economy went into recession in February, ending more than 10 years of expansion. The Labor Department reports 11.5 million layoffs in March, then 7.7 million more in April. The Fed is expected to keep interest rates near zero as it works to usher along a recovery. But Heritage Foundation economist Stephen Moore says the speed in which the nation bounces back depends largely on state economies.
What matters most is getting these states open for businesses, because as we've seen in Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Georgia and so many of these red states with Republican governors, that once they open up their businesses, people come back to the stores, people come back to work, and revenue starts flowing again.
The Fed has already offered trillions in support to financial markets and worked with the Treasury on loans to small and medium-sized businesses. And while there's talk of another massive stimulus package, Republicans want to wait and see. President Trump is optimistic following the May rebound of 2.5 million jobs, tweeting, quote, "I built the greatest economy in the world, the best the U.S. has ever had. I'm doing it again." 2020 contender Joe Biden pushed back, writing, quote, "Trump squandered a growing economy."
Donald Trump has to convince the American people that he's got the American economy on the right track. And I think the big issue for the election in November 2020 is the answer to this question. Do you believe that Donald J. Trump or Joe Biden is ever better able to guide us back into prosperity?
While Biden leads Trump overall, registered voters believe the president is more equipped to oversee an economic recovery. According to a recent NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 48% to 37% give Trump the advantage in handling the economy. Currently, all 50 states are in some phase of reopening, but some are seeing an increase in coronavirus cases, which could lead officials to slow the pace of people getting back to work. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Thank you, Caitlin. Turning overseas, the world's nuclear watchdog is voicing concerns about Iran's uranium enrichment. The International Atomic Energy Agency says the Islamic regime has denied access to 2 inspection sites for more than 4 months, and that Iran has increased its uranium stockpile, though it has stopped short of weapons-grade enrichment. Meanwhile, satellite images show the rogue nation appears to have built a mock U.S. aircraft carrier, which could be used for potential live fire drills. It's modeled off Nimitz-class carriers the U.S. Navy routinely sends into the Persian Gulf. Well, Christians in northeast Syria are facing persecution under Turkish troops. U.S.-led coalition forces drove ISIS from the area back in 2017. When the United States withdrew last year, Turkish forces took control of the territory. Nadine Maenza of the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom tells CBN News the area that had once been an example for religious freedom in the Middle East is now suffering under Turkish troops.
They've entered now 3 times into area governed by the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. And each time they've entered, they have come in and governed by taking away religious freedom and instituting really harsh Islamic ideology that goes against the religious freedom that the Autonomous Administration has been supporting in the region.
And Pat, the commission's hearing today examines how to restore those freedoms.
Well, I believe that I have got the word that's going to come out, and I may be wrong, but I do think that coming up in this election, the economy will be probably coming back pretty well, and the president will win a victory in the polls over Joe Biden because of the economic aspects of it and other factors. But I think he's going to be severely tested. It's going to be really potentially leading up to war. The Chinese are aggressively moving into the South China Sea. Their so-called hegemony. They're pushing as hard as they can. They're building up weapons. The Russians are doing the same thing, building up advanced weapons. The Iranians are going to do everything they can to challenge us in the Middle East. And you can absolutely lay a bet on it that Erdogan in Turkey, who's a dedicated Muslim, wants to revive the caliphate with him as the caliph. The Turks are going to be giving us a lot of trouble. And the president's going to be facing all of that, and every one of them could lead to some kind of a war, not to mention the North Koreans. So if you ever want to do some praying, I'd pray for our president, because he's going to be facing with challenges that probably no president in the history of America has ever had to contend with.